Deep in the Pacific Northwest wilderness, something waits in the shadows of towering cedars and ancient ferns. When experienced hiker Marcus Thompson set out for what should have been a routine 3-day trek through uncharted territory, he expected solitude, fresh air, and the peaceful silence that only old-growth forests can provide. What he found instead was a village that shouldn't exist. Hidden beneath a canopy so thick that satellite images never captured it, the settlement appeared frozen in time. Wooden structures weathered by centuries stood in perfect formation around a central fire pit where embers still glowed. Ceremonial masks hung from doorways, their hollow eyes seeming to track his movement. The air itself felt heavy with secrets. No footprints marked the soft earth, yet something told him he wasn't alone. But here's what still keeps Marcus awake at night. Did he really find that village, or did it find him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Thompson had always been drawn to places where civilization ended and wilderness began. At 53, he carried the weathered hands of a man who understood the language of mountains and forests better than he understood most people. His backpack, methodically packed the night before, contained 3 days' worth of provisions, a professional-grade camera, and the hand-carved hiking staff his grandfather had given him 30 years ago. The wolf head carved into its top had been polished smooth by decades of use, its amber eyes seeming to watch the trail ahead with ancient wisdom. The morning air in the Cascade foothills held that crisp quality that only September could deliver. Marcus adjusted the straps of his pack and studied the topographical map one final time. His planned route would take him through established trails for the first day, then branch off into territory marked only by elevation lines and the thin blue threads of unnamed streams. These were the places that called to him now, the blank spaces between the known world and whatever lay beyond. His grandfather's stories echoed in his memory as he locked his truck and shouldered his pack. The old man had spoken of hidden places in these mountains, valleys that existed between the maps, where time moved differently and the spirits of the first people still walked. Marcus had dismissed these tales as the romantic wanderings of an aging mind, but something about the way his grandfather's eyes had grown distant during those stories suggested deeper truths. The first few hours passed in comfortable rhythm. Marcus's boots found their familiar cadence on the well-worn trail, his breathing settling into the steady pattern that would carry him through the day. He paused occasionally to photograph particularly striking combinations of light and shadow, the way morning sun filtered through old-growth cedar and fir to create cathedral spaces between the trunks. By noon, he had reached the point where he would leave the established trail. His GPS showed his position clearly, a small blue dot surrounded by the green expanse of national forest. The device hummed reassuringly in his palm, its satellite connection strong and clear. He marked his departure point and slipped the unit back into his pack's side pocket. The terrain immediately grew more challenging. Without the benefit of trail maintenance, fallen logs became obstacles to navigate around or climb over. Streams required careful rock hopping or, in some cases, acceptance that wet boots were part of the experience. Marcus found himself consulting his compass more frequently, cross-referencing its reading with his map to ensure he maintained his intended heading. It was during one of these navigation checks that he first noticed something unusual. A raven perched on a branch perhaps 20 feet away, watching him with the kind of focused attention that seemed almost deliberate. When Marcus moved, the bird moved with him, maintaining its distance but never losing sight of him. This continued for nearly an hour, the raven occasionally cawing in what sounded almost like commentary on his progress. The afternoon brought subtle changes that Marcus's experienced eye couldn't quite categorize. The forest seemed to grow quieter, the usual sounds of smaller birds and scurrying creatures fading until only his footsteps and breathing marked his passage. The trees themselves appeared older here, their trunks reaching massive proportions that spoke of centuries undisturbed by logging or fire. Most unsettling was the way his equipment began to behave. His GPS, which had functioned perfectly all morning, started showing intermittent signal loss. The compass needle, normally steady and reliable, would occasionally swing in slow circles before settling back to its proper bearing. Marcus checked and rechecked his gear, finding no obvious malfunctions, yet the erratic behavior continued. As evening approached, he began looking for a suitable campsite. The raven, his constant companion throughout the afternoon, had finally disappeared, leaving him with a solitude that felt deeper and more complete than anything he had experienced in years of wilderness travel. He found a small clearing beside a creek that ran clear and cold over granite stones worn smooth by countless seasons of snowmelt. While setting up his tent, Marcus discovered markings carved into the bark of a nearby cedar. They weren't the random scratches of animals or the crude initials of previous visitors. These symbols had been deliberately carved with tools, forming patterns that suggested meaning beyond his understanding. The cuts were old, the bark having grown around them in places, but they remained clearly visible in the fading light. That night, as he lay in his sleeping bag, listening to the creek's gentle murmur, Marcus felt the first stirrings of something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear exactly, but rather a sense of approaching significance, as if tomorrow would bring encounters that would change his understanding of what was possible in these ancient mountains. Marcus woke before dawn to the sound of absolute silence. In 30 years of wilderness camping, he had never experienced such complete absence of sound. No wind stirred the branches overhead, no insects hummed their nighttime songs, and even the creek that had lulled him to sleep seemed to have stopped its gentle murmur. He lay still in his sleeping bag, straining to hear something, anything, that would confirm the world outside his tent still existed. When he finally unzipped the tent flap and stepped into the pre-dawn darkness, the silence felt almost physical, pressing against his eardrums like deep water. His headlamp beam revealed a world transformed by heavy dew that caught the light like scattered diamonds on every surface. The air tasted different too, carrying flavors of cedar and something else he couldn't identify, something ancient and green. His morning routine felt surreal in the profound quiet. The click of his camp stove igniting sounded like thunder, and the bubbling of water heating for coffee seemed loud enough to wake the entire forest. Yet nothing stirred beyond his small circle of lamplight. Even the usual dawn chorus of birds failed to materialize as the sky slowly lightened from black to deep purple. Marcus pulled out his weather-worn trail map, spreading it across a flat boulder while he sipped his coffee. The paper showed the standard green areas of national forest, brown contour lines indicating elevation changes, and blue marks for streams and lakes. But as he studied the section he intended to explore today, something seemed wrong. Blank spaces that should have contained topographical details appeared larger than he remembered, as if the cartographers had simply given up trying to map certain areas. He traced his finger along his planned route, noting how the map's details became increasingly sparse the further he intended to travel from established trails. Where he expected to find the usual symbols for geographic features, he found only empty white space, broken by occasional elevation numbers that seemed to follow no logical pattern. His GPS unit offered no better guidance. The device powered on normally, but showed his current position as a blinking question mark, surrounded by grey void where the detailed satellite imagery should have been. The coordinates displayed as a string of zeros and dashes that meant nothing. Marcus cycled through the device's various screens, but each one showed the same impossible result. According to the most sophisticated navigation technology available, he simply didn't exist. The compass proved equally unreliable. The needle swung slowly from one direction to another, never settling on any particular bearing for more than a few seconds. Marcus held the device at arm's length, away from any metal objects that might cause interference. But the erratic behavior continued. Sometimes the needle would stop completely, pointing in a direction that felt wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. Despite the equipment failures, Marcus felt drawn to continue deeper into the unmapped territory. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory, recounting stories of places that existed between the known and unknown. Valleys that appeared on no maps because they belonged to older ways of understanding the world. Perhaps this was one of those places, somewhere that modern technology couldn't quite grasp or classify. He packed his gear with extra care, double-checking that everything was secure. If his navigation equipment couldn't be trusted, he would have to rely on older methods, the position of the sun, the flow of water, and the subtle signs that experienced woodsmen had used for generations before satellites and digital displays. The terrain grew more challenging as he left his campsite behind. Ancient trees reached proportions that defied his understanding of forest ecology. Douglas firs stretched upward until their tops disappeared into a canopy so thick that sunlight reached the forest floor only in scattered golden beams. The undergrowth thinned in the perpetual twilight beneath these giants, creating cathedral-like spaces between massive trunks. Marcus began to notice other changes as well. The forest floor, usually carpeted with the accumulated debris of countless seasons, appeared unnaturally clean. No fallen branches cluttered his path. No rotting logs created obstacles to navigate around. It was as if someone, or something, maintained these spaces with careful attention to order and passage. Most unsettling were the continued markings he found carved into tree bark. The symbols appeared at regular intervals, always at eye level, always clearly visible despite their obvious age. They seemed to follow a pattern that suggested direction or guidance, though Marcus couldn't decipher their meaning. Some resembled animals, others looked like geometric shapes, and a few appeared to be stylized representations of natural features like mountains or rivers. As the day progressed, the atmosphere itself seemed to change. The air grew thicker, more substantial, as if he were climbing to a much higher altitude despite his altimeter showing no significant elevation gain. Each breath required slightly more effort, and sounds carried differently, seeming to come from directions that didn't match their apparent sources. Late in the afternoon, as shadows began to lengthen and the forest light took on that golden quality that photographers prize above all others, Marcus caught his first glimpse of something that shouldn't have been there. Through a gap in the massive tree trunks, partially obscured by hanging moss and filtered sunlight, he saw the unmistakable straight lines of human construction. He stopped walking and crouched low, using the trunk of an enormous cedar for cover. His heart rate increased as training from decades of wilderness photography kicked in. When documenting wildlife or remote locations, patience and careful observation often revealed far more than rushing forward with cameras blazing. He remained motionless for nearly 10 minutes, watching and listening for any signs of current habitation. What he saw defied easy categorization. The structures were clearly man-made, but their construction style belonged to no modern era. Wooden buildings rose from the forest floor in careful arrangement, their walls made from logs so expertly fitted that no chinking appeared between them. Cedar-shake roofs, darkened by centuries of weather, still maintained their structural integrity despite obvious age. The architecture spoke of people who understood how to build for permanence, who worked with the forest rather than against it. Marcus pulled out his professional camera, a habit so ingrained that his hands moved automatically to adjust settings for the challenging light conditions. Through the telephoto lens, he could see the settlement in greater detail. The buildings formed a rough circle around what appeared to be a central gathering area. Elevated walkways connected some structures, keeping them above the forest floor's seasonal flooding. Every design choice showed intimate knowledge of how this environment behaved through the cycles of years. What troubled him most was the complete absence of decay that should have marked any abandoned settlement. The wood showed weathering but no rot. No broken windows or collapsed roofs marked the passage of time. No vegetation had reclaimed the cleared spaces between buildings. It was as if the entire village existed in some state of suspended animation, preserved against the natural forces that claimed all human works in the wilderness. He raised the camera to his eye and pressed the shutter. Nothing happened. The digital display flickered and went dark. Marcus checked the battery indicator, which had shown full charge that morning, but the screen remained blank. He tried removing and reinserting the battery, but the camera refused to power on. His backup point-and-shoot camera proved equally unresponsive, as did his cell phone when he tried to use its camera function. The technological failures felt significant in ways that made his skin crawl. In all his years of wilderness photography, equipment might malfunction due to extreme cold or moisture, but never had multiple devices failed simultaneously in moderate conditions. Something about this place actively resisted documentation, as if it preferred to remain unseen by the outside world. As he studied the village through his naked eyes, Marcus began to notice details that his camera lens hadn't revealed. Smoke rose from several chimneys in thin, straight lines that spoke of fires recently tended. Hanging from doorways and porch eaves, objects swayed gently in breezes he couldn't feel. The central area contained what appeared to be a large fire pit surrounded by seating, and though he was too far away to be certain, he thought he could see the red glow of live coals. Most unsettling was the massive totem that stood at what seemed to be the village's main entrance. Carved from a single enormous cedar trunk, it rose perhaps 30 feet into the air, its surface covered with intricate figures representing animals, humans, and beings that combined features of both. At the top, a carved eagle spread wings so detailed that individual feathers were visible even at his distance. But it was the eyes scattered throughout the carving that drew his attention. They seemed to track movement, following him as he shifted position behind his concealment. Marcus spent nearly an hour watching the village, looking for any sign of current inhabitants. No figures moved between the buildings. No faces appeared in windows. No sounds of human activity reached his position. Yet something about the scene suggested recent occupation. Clothing hung from lines strung between posts. Garden areas showed the geometric patterns of deliberate cultivation. Paths between buildings were too well maintained to be the result of animal traffic alone. The rational part of his mind offered explanations. Perhaps this was a historical recreation maintained by park services or cultural organizations. Maybe he had stumbled upon a living history project designed to demonstrate traditional building techniques. But none of these explanations felt adequate when measured against what his senses told him about this place's fundamental strangeness. As evening approached and the light began to fail, Marcus faced a decision that would define everything that followed. He could retreat to safer ground, make camp at a distance, and approach the settlement in the morning with better preparation. Or he could trust his instincts and investigate while the mysterious twilight still provided cover for observation. Marcus chose to move forward. Something deeper than curiosity drove him now, a pull that seemed to originate from the village itself. He approached with the careful steps of a man who understood that he was crossing more than just physical ground. Each footfall felt deliberate, significant, as if the earth beneath his boots was measuring his worthiness for what lay ahead. The moment he stepped past the towering entrance totem, the world changed. The air grew thick and substantial, carrying scents of wood smoke, cedar, and something else he couldn't identify, but that stirred memories he didn't remember making. The temperature dropped several degrees, and his breath began to mist, despite the mild evening air he had been walking through just moments before. At the village's heart lay a perfect circle of black obsidian stones, each one roughly the size of a human head and polished to mirror smoothness. They were arranged with mathematical precision around a central fire pit where flames danced without any visible fuel. The fire burned with colors that seemed impossible, blues and greens mixing with traditional oranges and reds in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Marcus approached the stone circle with reverence he couldn't explain. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory, fragments of stories about sacred places where the spirits of ancestors gathered to watch over their descendants. The old man had spoken of meditation circles where time moved differently, where the past and present existed simultaneously for those who knew how to see. As he drew closer to the obsidian stones, whispers began. They started so softly that he thought they might be wind moving through leaves, but the words gradually became distinct, despite being in a language he had never heard. The voices carried tones of welcome mixed with warning, as if speakers were debating his presence among themselves. Some voices sounded ancient beyond measure, while others seemed to belong to children, whose laughter held notes of sadness. Marcus knelt beside one of the obsidian stones and placed his palm against its surface. The rock felt warm, almost alive, pulsing with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and gradually he began to understand that they weren't exactly words, but rather direct transmission of meaning into his consciousness. Welcome, descendant. You have been long awaited. The voice that formed these thoughts in his mind carried the weight of enormous age and patience. Marcus looked around the circle but saw no one, only the dancing flames and the dark stones that reflected firelight in their polished surfaces. You carry the blood of those who walked here before. Your grandfather's grandfather knew this place. His sins brought suffering, but his bloodline may yet bring healing. Images flooded Marcus's mind without warning. He saw the village, as it had been centuries ago, filled with people going about their daily lives. Men returned from hunting with deer slung across their shoulders. Women worked hides and gathered berries, while children played games that had been old when the first Europeans reached these shores. Elders sat in the stone circle, their voices carrying wisdom accumulated over lifetimes of careful observation. Then came darker visions. Soldiers in uniforms that belonged to no army Marcus recognized moved through the village like a plague. Buildings burned, people scattered into the forest, and sacred objects were taken or destroyed with casual disregard for their significance. The obsidian circle was broken, its stones scattered, and the sacred fire was extinguished for the first time in generations beyond counting. But worst of all was the realization of who led these soldiers. A young man whose features bore an unmistakable resemblance to Marcus himself commanded the destruction. This ancestor, whose name the spirits whispered with combinations of pity and anger, had used his mixed heritage to guide outsiders to the hidden village, believing he was bringing progress and civilization to a backward people. The whispers grew urgent now, overlapping each other in their haste to make him understand. The circle was restored, but incompletely. The fire burns but cannot warm. The dead rest but cannot sleep. Your blood opened the door that your blood once closed. Now you must choose. Continue your ancestors' work of destruction, or begin the work of healing that only his bloodline can complete. Marcus felt the weight of generations pressing down on him. The comfortable world of rational explanation crumbled as he knelt beside the fire that burned without fuel, listening to voices that spoke without sound. Time itself seemed suspended, waiting for his response to an invitation he was only beginning to understand. The obsidian stones grew warmer under his touch, and shadows began to move independently of the flames that cast them. In those shadows, he caught glimpses of faces watching him, with expressions that mixed hope with centuries of patient waiting. Marcus stood and backed away from the obsidian circle, his rational mind struggling to process what he had experienced. The whispers followed him as he moved deeper into the village, exploring the structures that seemed to exist in perfect preservation despite their obvious age. Each building he approached revealed details that defied conventional understanding of how abandoned places should appear. The first dwelling he examined contained furnishings that looked as if their owners had stepped out moments ago. Woven baskets sat beside doorways filled with dried corn and beans that showed no signs of decay. Sleeping furs were arranged on raised platforms, their pelts still soft and supple. Clay pots contained water that reflected his face with impossible clarity, as if the vessels had been filled from mountain springs that morning. But it was the sound that unsettled him most. From somewhere above his head came the gentle clacking of objects striking each other in rhythmic patterns. Marcus looked up to see what appeared to be wind chimes hanging from the dwelling's eaves, but these were unlike any decorative items he had ever encountered. Strung together with sinew were dozens of small bones, polished white and carved with intricate patterns. Among the bones, he could make out what looked disturbingly like human teeth. The chimes moved constantly, despite the complete absence of any breeze. They created melodies that seemed almost musical, combinations of tones that rose and fell with the complexity of composed pieces. Sometimes the sounds resembled conversations, as if the bones were speaking to each other in a language of clicks and whispers. Marcus reached up to touch one of the hanging bones, and immediately pulled his hand back as if burned. The moment his finger made contact, images flashed through his mind with stunning clarity. He saw the village in its final days, watched families gathering their most precious possessions, while warriors prepared for a battle they knew they could not win. The bone chimes had been crafted from the remains of beloved ancestors, creating a warning system that would sound when danger approached. But these particular chimes served a different purpose now. The teeth and bones belonged to those who had died defending the village, and their spiritual essence remained bound to these physical remnants. They watched over the settlement still, alerting the other spirits when visitors crossed the threshold into their preserved world. As Marcus moved from building to building, the bone chimes in each dwelling began to sing. Their melodies grew more complex, more urgent, as if they were announcing his presence to every corner of the village. The sounds created harmonies that seemed to come from all directions at once. Surrounding him with music that belonged to no earthly tradition, he entered what appeared to be a larger, communal building, perhaps a meeting hall or place of ceremony. The interior space was vast, with a domed ceiling that disappeared into shadows his eyes couldn't penetrate. Along the walls, dozens of masks hung at precisely spaced intervals. Each one had been carved from different types of wood and decorated with feathers, shells, and pigments that retained their vivid colors despite obvious age. The masks represented animals, spirits, and beings that combined features of both. A raven mask with obsidian eyes seemed to track his movement across the room. A bear mask with real claws attached to its muzzle appeared to breathe slowly and steadily. Most disturbing was a mask that seemed to represent a human face, but with features that shifted and changed whenever he looked at it directly. Marcus approached one of the masks, drawn by craftsmanship so exquisite that individual wood grains had been incorporated into the design. As he drew closer, he realized that shadows moved behind the eye holes, as if something was looking back at him from within the carved wood. The bone chimes outside grew more frantic, their rhythmic clacking becoming almost violent in its intensity. Marcus turned toward the building's entrance and saw a sight that made his blood freeze. Silhouettes moved across the doorway, human-shaped shadows that belonged to no visible bodies. They passed back and forth as if patrolling the entrance, occasionally pausing to peer into the building where he stood. One shadow separated itself from the others and began to move into the building. It had no substance that Marcus could detect, no body that blocked light or displaced air, yet its presence filled the space with a cold that made his breath steam. The shadow approached slowly, deliberately, and Marcus found himself backing deeper into the building until his shoulders pressed against the far wall. The masks around him began to whisper, their carved mouths moving with words in the same unknown language he had heard at the stone circle. Some voices seemed to offer protection, while others spoke with tones that sounded like warnings or threats. Marcus fled the mask-filled building as the shadow figure drew closer, his heart pounding with primal fear that overrode rational thought. Outside, the bone chimes had fallen silent, creating an oppressive quiet that seemed to press against his eardrums. The village around him appeared subtly different now, as if his presence had awakened something that had been dormant. He needed shelter and time to process what he was experiencing. His rational mind insisted that stress, altitude, and isolation were creating hallucinations. But his body responded to these supernatural encounters with the same adrenaline surge that had kept his ancestors alive in genuinely dangerous situations. Whether real or imagined, his nervous system treated these experiences as threats requiring immediate response. Marcus chose a smaller dwelling near the village's edge, hoping that distance from the central stone circle might provide some respite from the intense spiritual activity. The building was constructed like the others, with walls of expertly fitted logs and a cedar-shake roof that showed no signs of deterioration. A single window opening looked out toward the forest, and the doorway was covered by a hanging mat woven from plant fibers. Inside, the space was simple but complete. A raised sleeping platform occupied one corner, covered with furs that felt impossibly soft when he tested them with his fingertips. Clay vessels of various sizes sat arranged along one wall, and a small fire pit in the center of the room showed signs of recent use. Most intriguingly, hanging from a wooden peg near the doorway was a leather pouch decorated with beadwork so intricate that each tiny glass bead seemed to catch and hold. Light. Marcus approached the pouch with the caution he now applied to every object in this place. When he lifted it from its peg, the leather felt warm and supple, as if it had been recently handled. The beadwork depicted animals and geometric patterns that seemed to shift and change as he examined them. Opening the pouch revealed contents that defied explanation. Inside were plants that appeared to be freshly gathered. Leaves that should have dried and crumbled centuries ago remained green and flexible. Berries still held their natural moisture and color. Roots showed no signs of decay or dehydration. Most impossibly, some of the plant specimens seemed to continue growing within the confines of the pouch, tiny new shoots emerging from stems as he watched. Without conscious thought, Marcus selected one of the leaves and examined it closely. It resembled plants he knew from wilderness first aid training, species used by indigenous peoples for treating cuts and infections. A small scratch on his hand from the day's hiking had been bothering him, a minor irritation that he had ignored in the excitement of discovery. He crushed the leaf between his fingers, releasing oils that smelled of mint and something more complex. When he applied the plant matter to his scratch, the relief was immediate and complete. Not only did the minor pain disappear, but the wound itself seemed to close and heal as he watched. Within minutes, no trace of the injury remained on his skin. Marcus stared at his unmarked hand with wonder and growing unease. Plants didn't behave this way in the natural world he understood. Healing processes that should take days were occurring in moments. The very laws of biology seemed suspended in this place, replaced by older rules that operated according to different principles. As darkness fell outside his temporary shelter, exhaustion finally overcame his excitement and fear. Marcus arranged the furs on the sleeping platform and settled down for what he expected to be a restless night, filled with vivid dreams and fragmentary sleep. Instead, he fell into a profound slumber that felt like sinking into warm, dark water. His dreams were unlike anything he had previously experienced. Instead of the chaotic imagery and impossible logic that usually characterize sleep, these visions felt more real than waking life. He saw the village as it had been in its prime, filled with people whose faces he somehow recognized despite never having seen them before. Children played games, while adults worked at crafts that required skills passed down through generations. Most vividly, he witnessed ceremonies that took place in the stone circle. Elders sat in meditation, while the sacred fire burned with the same impossible colors he had seen upon his arrival. Voices rose in songs that seemed to harmonize with the very heartbeat of the earth itself. The obsidian stones glowed within a light, and the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds dissolved completely. When Marcus woke, sunlight was streaming through the window opening, but something was different. His belongings, which he had left scattered around the dwelling in his haste to seek shelter, were now arranged with careful precision. His backpack sat upright near the doorway, its contents organized with military efficiency. His boots had been cleaned and placed side by side. Even his grandfather's walking stick had been positioned prominently where he would see it immediately upon waking. Marcus emerged from the dwelling to find the village transformed by morning light. What had appeared mysterious and slightly threatening in the previous evening's shadows now revealed itself as a place of profound beauty and careful design. Every structure, every pathway, every planted area showed evidence of people who understood how to live in harmony with their environment rather than in opposition to it. But it was the central fire pit that drew his attention most powerfully. The obsidian stones that had been warm to his touch the night before now glowed with internal light that had nothing to do with reflected sunlight. The fire itself burned more brightly than before, its impossible colors creating patterns that seemed to carry meaning just beyond his understanding. As Marcus approached the stone circle, the flames suddenly roared higher, reaching toward the sky in a column of blue and green fire that should have consumed everything within reach. Instead, the flames remained contained within the stone boundary, dancing and writhing with an energy that felt alive and aware. Then, as if responding to some unheard command, the fire settled back to its normal size and intensity. Around the fire pit, shadows began to move independently of any objects that might cast them. These weren't the threatening presences he had encountered the previous evening, but rather the outlines of people engaged in activities he couldn't quite see. Some shadows sat in positions that suggested meditation or council meetings. Others moved in patterns that resembled dance or ritual ceremony. Marcus found himself drawn to sit beside the fire, and as he settled onto the ground near one of the obsidian stones, the shadows became more distinct. He began to see faces in profile, figures wearing clothing and ornaments that belonged to no historical period he recognized. These were the people who had lived here, he realized, their spiritual presence so strong that it left permanent impressions on the fabric of the place itself. The fire crackled and spoke in a language of sparks and ember whispers. Marcus found that if he relaxed his normal way of listening and allowed the sounds to wash over him like music, fragments of meaning began to emerge. The flames were telling him stories, sharing the accumulated wisdom and memory of all who had gathered around this sacred fire throughout generations of use. He learned that the village existed at a crossing point between worlds, a place where the boundary between physical and spiritual reality grew thin enough for communication and travel between dimensions. The obsidian stones served as anchors, holding the crossing point stable and allowing the spirits of the departed to remain connected to the world they had loved in life. But something had gone wrong. The flames showed him visions of violence and betrayal, times when the sacred boundary had been violated by those who understood neither its significance nor the consequences of their actions. The spirits had been trapped in a state between worlds, unable to complete their journey to final rest, but unable to return fully to physical existence. Most disturbing were the images the fire revealed of his own family history. Marcus saw his great-great-grandfather as a young man, wearing the uniform of territorial militia and carrying orders that would change everything. The documents authorized the removal of indigenous peoples from lands that had been designated for other uses. And Marcus's ancestor had volunteered to guide the soldiers because of his knowledge of hidden villages and secret paths. The flames showed him scenes of the final battle, when desperate warriors had made their last stand, while elders worked frantically to complete protective rituals that might preserve something of their people's presence in this sacred place. Marcus watched in horror as his ancestor led soldiers through defenses that should have been impregnable. using his mixed heritage and knowledge of sacred traditions to overcome protections that had kept the village safe for centuries. But the fire also showed him something else, something that filled him with both hope and terrible responsibility. In the final moments before the village fell, the surviving elders had woven a binding that connected the place's spiritual essence to the bloodline of the one who had betrayed them. They had ensured that eventually someone from that family line would return, someone who might have the power to complete the interrupted rituals and allow the trapped spirits to find their way to peace. Marcus understood now why his grandfather had told stories of hidden places and lost peoples. The old man had felt the pull of this place throughout his entire life, but had never found the courage to seek it out and face what he would find there. The responsibility had passed to the next generation, then the next, until finally it reached someone willing to follow the call into the wilderness. The fire settled into a gentle glow, and the shadows around the circle turned toward him with expressions that mixed hope with patient waiting. They had been expecting him. Everything that had brought him to this moment, from his grandfather's stories to his own love of wild places, had been preparation for this encounter. That evening, as Marcus prepared for his second night in the village, he discovered something that made his breath catch in his throat. Hanging in the dwelling where he had chosen to stay was an object that hadn't been there before, suspended from a wooden beam above the sleeping platform where he couldn't possibly have missed it during his earlier examination of the space. The dream catcher was unlike any he had seen in museums or tourist shops. Its frame was woven from what appeared to be spider silk, but the strands caught and held light in ways that natural silk never could. Within the web-like pattern, tiny points of illumination moved and shifted like captured stars, creating constellations that seemed to tell stories as they slowly rotated through their celestial dance. Marcus approached the dream catcher with the reverence he had learned to apply to everything in this place. As he drew closer, he realized that the points of light within the web weren't reflecting illumination from any external source. They generated their own radiance, each one pulsing with a rhythm that seemed synchronized with his heartbeat. The silver strands of the web itself seemed to be spun from moonlight and morning mist, materials that shouldn't be able to exist in solid form, yet clearly did. Hanging from the bottom of the dream catcher were feathers that moved constantly, despite the absence of any breeze. They were arranged in a pattern that created subtle harmonies as they brushed against each other, sounds so gentle that Marcus had to strain to hear them. Each feather appeared to come from a different bird species, and some were from creatures he couldn't identify, despite his extensive knowledge of regional wildlife. As night fell and Marcus settled onto the sleeping platform beneath the dream catcher, its presence became more pronounced. The points of light grew brighter, and the silver web began to emit a barely audible humming that seemed to emanate from the very structure of reality itself. The feathers moved more actively, creating melodies that resembled lullabies sung in languages that predated written history. His sleep that night was profound, but filled with experiences that went far beyond ordinary dreaming. The dream catcher seemed to serve as a filter, allowing only certain types of spiritual communication to reach his sleeping consciousness, while protecting him from influences that might cause harm. Through this protective barrier, Marcus experienced visions that felt more like memories than dreams. He walked through the village as it had been in its prime, participating in daily life as if he belonged there. Children accepted his presence without question, and elders included him in conversations about matters that required generations of accumulated wisdom to understand. He learned to identify plants by their spiritual properties rather than their physical characteristics, to read weather patterns in the flight of birds, and to understand the complex relationships that connected all living things in webs of mutual dependence. Most significantly, he experienced the village's spiritual practices firsthand. He sat in the stone circle during ceremonies that connected the living community with ancestors who had passed into the spirit world, but maintained their interest in the welfare of their descendants. He witnessed healings that addressed not just physical ailments, but spiritual imbalances that could affect entire families for generations. Through these dream experiences, Marcus began to understand that the village existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions of reality. Its physical form occupied space in the forest where he had discovered it, but its spiritual essence extended into realms that interpenetrated the everyday world without being visible to ordinary perception. The dream catcher allowed him to experience these expanded dimensions while maintaining his connection to his own time and place, but the dreams also revealed darker truths about what had happened during the village's destruction. Marcus witnessed the moment when protective barriers that had shielded the community for centuries were breached by someone who understood their secret methods. He watched as sacred objects were stolen or destroyed, as families were scattered, and as the careful balance between physical and spiritual worlds was violently disrupted. Most painfully, he experienced the moment when the surviving elders realized that their traditional methods of spiritual protection had been compromised by betrayal from within their own community. The trust that had allowed someone of mixed heritage to learn their deepest secrets had been violated in ways that wounded the very foundation of their worldview. Yet even in these darkest visions, Marcus sensed underlying currents of hope and determination. The elders had known that their physical community was doomed, but they had worked with desperate efficiency to preserve something essential that might eventually allow for healing and restoration. The dream catcher itself was part of these preservation efforts, a tool that could protect and guide someone who might one day return to complete what had been interrupted. On his third morning in the village, Marcus discovered an object that changed everything he thought he understood about his situation. In the center of the stone circle, where the sacred fire continued its eternal burning, sat a bowl that hadn't been there the day before. Carved from a single piece of dark wood and polished to mirror smoothness, it contained water so clear and still that it seemed to capture and hold the morning sky within its depths. The bowl appeared to be very old, its surface marked with symbols that matched those he had seen carved into tree bark throughout his journey. But despite its obvious age, the wood showed no signs of cracking or weathering. Water filled it to the very brim, without ever spilling over, even when gentle breezes should have created ripples across its surface. Marcus knelt beside the bowl and peered into its depths. At first, he saw only his own reflection staring back from water so clear it seemed like liquid glass. But as he continued to look, the surface began to change. Images formed in the still water, scenes that played out like movies, projected onto a screen that existed in dimensions his eyes couldn't quite grasp. The visions began with familiar scenes from his own life. He watched himself as a child, sitting beside his grandfather, while the old man told stories of ancient peoples and sacred places. He saw his younger self dismissing these tales as fantasy, too eager to embrace the modern world to pay attention to what he assumed were the wanderings of an aging mind. But the water showed him perspectives he had never considered. Marcus watched his grandfather's face during those storytelling sessions and saw pain hidden beneath the surface of each narrative. The old man hadn't been sharing folklore or entertainment. He'd been passing down a burden that had weighed on their family for generations, hoping that someone in the next generation would prove strong enough to carry it. The images in the bowl grew more specific and more disturbing. Marcus saw his grandfather as a young man, wearing work clothes and carrying surveying equipment through these same forests. The year appeared to be sometime in the 1950s, based on the clothing and technology visible in the vision. His grandfather was leading a team of men who were mapping the area for purposes that the water gradually revealed. They were planning to flood the valley. A hydroelectric project would create a reservoir that would generate power for growing communities in the region, and his grandfather's job was to identify any obstacles to the project's completion. When the survey team discovered the hidden village, most of them saw only empty buildings that would be submerged anyway. But Marcus's grandfather recognized something that the others missed. The water showed him scenes of his grandfather alone in the village, experiencing the same supernatural encounters that Marcus was living through now. The young man had seen the spirits, heard the whispers, and understood that he had stumbled upon something that existed beyond the boundaries of normal reality. More importantly, he had realized that flooding the valley would trap the spirits forever, preventing them from completing their interrupted journey to final rest. But the water revealed his grandfather's ultimate failure of courage. When the time came to report his findings, the young man had chosen silence. The economic opportunities offered by the hydroelectric project, combined with fears about how reports of supernatural encounters might affect his professional reputation, led him to omit any mention of the village's spiritual significance from his official documentation. Marcus watched in horror as the water showed him construction crews arriving to begin work on the dam. But something unexpected happened when they tried to flood the valley. Every attempt to raise the water level failed as streams mysteriously changed course, and underground channels drained any water that accumulated. The project was eventually abandoned, officially due to unforeseen geological complications. But the water revealed the true reason for its failure. The spirits of the village had fought back, using whatever power remained to them to prevent the final destruction of their sacred place. But the effort had cost them dearly, trapping them even more firmly in the liminal space between worlds, while they protected their home from forces they couldn't fully understand. The most devastating revelation came last. The water showed Marcus that his grandfather had returned to the village many times over the decades, drawn by guilt and a growing understanding of what his silence had cost. The old man had tried repeatedly to complete some kind of ritual that might release the spirits, but he lacked the knowledge and spiritual preparation necessary for such a complex undertaking. Marcus saw his grandfather's final visit to the village, when age and illness had weakened him beyond the point where the journey was physically possible. The old man had left something behind during that last visit, something intended for whoever might eventually follow in his footsteps and finish what he had been too frightened to attempt. Following the guidance he had received through the sacred water bowl, Marcus began searching for whatever his grandfather had left behind during his final visit to the village. The visions had suggested that the object would be found near the place where the village's war chief had made his last stand. Defending his people until his weapon broke and his strength failed, Marcus found the location behind the largest dwelling, where the forest pressed close to the village's edge. A single massive oak tree stood apart from the surrounding cedars and firs, its trunk scarred by what appeared to be axe cuts and claw marks. At the base of the tree, partially hidden by fallen leaves that never seemed to decay, Marcus discovered what he was looking for. The tomahawk was unlike any weapon he had seen in museums or historical displays. Its handle was carved from dark hardwood and wrapped with leather that still retained its flexibility despite obvious age. But the weapon was broken, split cleanly in two at the point where the stone head met the wooden shaft. The break was so precise that it looked deliberate, as if the weapon had been ceremonially destroyed rather than damaged in battle. As Marcus lifted the two pieces of the broken tomahawk, images flooded his mind with the same intensity he had experienced when touching the obsidian stones. He saw the village's final battle playing out in vivid detail, watched as warriors fought desperately to protect their families while women and children fled into the forest, carrying whatever sacred objects they could manage. The war chief had been a man of enormous presence and skill, someone who had earned his position through decades of wise leadership and proven courage. But in the visions Marcus witnessed, the chief faced an impossible situation. The attackers knew too much about the village's defenses, understood too well how to overcome protections that should have been impregnable to outsiders. Marcus saw the moment when the chief realized that someone had betrayed the village's secrets. The knowledge hit him like a physical blow, and the spiritual shock of that betrayal traveled through his tomahawk into the very heart of his being. The weapon, which had been blessed by generations of spiritual leaders and had never failed in righteous battle, cracked and split as the chief's faith in the world's fundamental order was shattered. But the broken weapon revealed something else in Marcus's visions. The war chief had understood that his people's physical defeat was inevitable, but he had used his final moments to bind his own spiritual essence to the weapon, creating a guardian presence that would watch over the village and judge anyone who might eventually come seeking to complete what had been interrupted. The spirit of the war chief had been testing Marcus since the moment he entered the village. Every supernatural encounter, every vision, every protective barrier that had shielded him from darker forces had been the result of this guardian presence evaluating his worthiness and intentions. The broken tomahawk was both symbol and tool, representing the damage that had been done to the spiritual balance of this place, while also serving as a key that might unlock the healing process. Marcus sat beneath the scarred oak tree, holding the two pieces of the broken weapon while afternoon shadows lengthened around him. He could feel the weight of generations pressing down on his shoulders, the accumulated sorrow and hope of people who had died, believing that someone would eventually come to complete their interrupted rituals and allow their spirits to find peace. But he also sensed growing impatience from other presences in the village. Not all of the spirits were benevolent or willing to wait much longer for resolution. Some had been twisted by centuries of trapped existence, becoming angry and desperate in ways that made them dangerous to themselves and to anyone who entered their domain. The broken tomahawk grew warm in his hands, and Marcus understood that he was approaching a point of no return. Soon he would have to choose between the safety of retreat and the terrible responsibility of attempting something that had defeated even his grandfather's repeated efforts. The war chief's spirit was offering him the tools and knowledge necessary for the healing ritual, but success would require him to risk everything, including his own life and sanity. As evening approached, Marcus made his decision. He would attempt the ritual that might release the trapped spirits, even though he understood that failure could trap his own soul in this place forever. The broken pieces of the tomahawk seemed to pulse with approval at his resolution, and somewhere in the forest around him, he heard the distant sound of drums beginning to beat in rhythms that belonged to no earthly tradition. As Marcus explored the village more thoroughly in preparation for the ritual he had committed to attempt, he discovered an area that broke his heart in ways he hadn't expected. Behind the communal meeting hall, in a space that had been carefully designed as a protected play area, he found evidence of the children who had lived here during the village's final days. Arranged in a perfect circle on ground that remained mysteriously free of fallen leaves and forest debris, were dozens of small dolls, each one crafted from corn husks and dressed in miniature versions of traditional clothing. The dolls had been positioned as if they were engaged in their own village activities. Some gathered around tiny fire pits made from pebbles, others arranged in hunting parties or ceremonial dances. What made the scene so emotionally devastating was the obvious care that had gone into each doll's creation. Tiny beads had been sewn onto clothing with stitches so small they could barely be seen. Hair made from corn silk had been braided and decorated with feathers smaller than Marcus's fingernail. Each doll had a distinct personality expressed through posture and positioning, suggesting that they had been beloved companions rather than simple toys. Marcus knelt beside the circle of dolls and immediately understood that these were not abandoned playthings. They represented something far more significant in the spiritual landscape of the village. Each doll had been crafted to contain a portion of a child's essence, creating connections that would allow the spirits of young people to maintain their presence in the physical world, even after their bodies had been destroyed. As he watched, the dolls began to move with subtle shifts that would have been easy to dismiss as tricks of light and shadow if he hadn't learned to see beyond normal perception. Tiny heads turned to look at him with expressions that seemed far too complex for inanimate objects. Small hands reached toward each other as if seeking comfort in an eternal embrace. The children's spirits were trapped here just as surely as the adults. But their situation was different in ways that made Marcus's heart ache. While the adult spirits had at least some understanding of what had happened to them and why they couldn't move on to final rest, the children remained confused and frightened, waiting for parents who would never return to take them home. Marcus reached out tentatively to touch one of the dolls, a small figure dressed in the clothing of a little girl and positioned as if she were dancing. The moment his finger made contact with the cornhusk surface, he was overwhelmed by emotions that belonged to a child's perspective on the village's destruction. He experienced the terror of that final day through young eyes, felt the confusion of being hurried away from home by adults whose faces showed fear the children had never seen before. He witnessed the desperate attempts of parents to hide their children in the forest, while sounds of battle echoed through the trees. Most heartbreakingly, he felt the children's bewilderment when their parents failed to return from what the adults had promised would be only a temporary separation. The children's spirits had been waiting for more than a century, convinced that their families would eventually come back for them. They had maintained their play area with the patient hope that only children possess, arranging and rearranging their dolls in endless scenarios that recreated the happy village life they remembered. But Marcus also sensed that the children's presence served an important function in the village's spiritual ecosystem. Their innocence and pure intention created a protective barrier that prevented the more damaged adult spirits from succumbing entirely to anger and despair. The children's faith that everything would eventually be made right again provided hope that sustained the entire community of trapped souls. As evening approached, Marcus realized that the children's spirits would be crucial to any successful healing ritual. Their pure energy could provide the spiritual foundation necessary to repair the damage that had been done to the village's connection between worlds. But involving them also meant accepting responsibility for souls who had suffered through no fault of their own, who deserved protection rather than further exposure to spiritual danger. The dolls continued their subtle movements as darkness fell, occasionally repositioning themselves in patterns that seemed to respond to Marcus's presence. Some moved closer to where he sat, as if seeking the comfort of adult protection they had been denied for so long. Others maintained their positions in the eternal play scenarios that helped them cope with their trapped existence. Marcus understood that his next actions would determine not just his own fate, but the future of these innocent spirits who had been waiting patiently for someone to guide them home. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like a physical burden, but it also strengthened his resolve to see the healing ritual through to completion, whatever the personal cost might prove to be. Marcus spent the next day in deep preparation, understanding that the ritual he was about to attempt would require not just courage, but specific knowledge that he could only acquire through direct communication with the village's spiritual guides. As evening approached, he returned to the stone circle where the sacred fire burned with its eternal flames, carrying with him the broken pieces of the war chief's tomahawk and a growing sense that time was running short. He arranged himself in the meditation posture he had seen in his visions, sitting cross-legged beside one of the obsidian stones with the broken weapon placed reverently before him. Almost immediately a presence made itself known, a spiritual entity so powerful and ancient that Marcus felt dwarfed by its accumulated wisdom and authority. The spirit that manifested belonged to the village's eldest leader, a man who had guided his people through decades of change and challenge before the final catastrophe. Unlike the other spirits Marcus had encountered, this one could communicate with crystal clarity, speaking directly into his consciousness with words that carried the weight of absolute truth. "You have come far, descendant of betrayal, but the journey ahead will test you beyond anything you have yet experienced. The ritual you seek to perform requires 3 elements that have been scattered and lost. Without them, any attempt at healing will fail and trap your own spirit alongside ours." The elder's presence filled Marcus's mind with images of the 3 sacred objects he would need to locate and restore. The first was a walking stick that had belonged to the village's chief spiritual guide, a staff crowned with an eagle feather that contained the accumulated wisdom of generations of healers and visionaries. This staff had been broken during the village's destruction, and its pieces hidden to prevent their power from being misused. The second object was a collection of sacred stones that had once formed a medicine wheel used for the most important spiritual ceremonies. These stones had been scattered when the village fell, their power dispersed but not destroyed. Marcus would need to locate each stone and restore them to their proper positions before the healing ritual could begin. Most challenging of all would be finding and restoring the village's primary burial ground, where the bones of ancestors had been disturbed and sacred protocols violated. The connection between the living and the dead had been severed when graves were desecrated, and without repairing this fundamental breach, the trapped spirits could never find their way to final rest. The elder's spirit provided Marcus with guidance about where to search for these scattered elements, but each location would require him to venture beyond the village into areas of the forest where spiritual dangers were even more intense. Some of the objects were guarded by entities that had been twisted by centuries of anger and loss, creatures that would not willingly surrender what they protected. "Time is not unlimited," the elder warned. "The celestial alignment that allows for such powerful healing occurs only once in a generation, and that window will open in 3 days. If you cannot gather the necessary elements by then, another chance will not come for decades, and by that time, some of our spirits will have deteriorated beyond the possibility of redemption." Marcus understood the gravity of what he was being asked to undertake. He would have less than 72 hours to locate objects that had been deliberately hidden or scattered across miles of wilderness, overcome whatever supernatural guardians protected them, and return to perform a ritual he had never seen completed successfully. But the elder's spirit offered him something that his grandfather had never possessed: complete knowledge of the ritual itself and the spiritual authority to perform it. The old chief began transferring this sacred information directly into Marcus's consciousness, filling his mind with chants, symbols, and procedures that had been passed down through generations of spiritual leaders. The process was overwhelming and physically exhausting. Marcus felt as if his skull was being stretched to contain knowledge that was too vast for any single human mind to hold. Ancient words in languages he had never heard flowed through his consciousness, along with complex understanding of how spiritual energy moved between dimensions and how damaged connections could be repaired. When the transfer was complete, Marcus found himself forever changed. He could see the world through spiritual perception that revealed layers of reality normally invisible to human eyes. The village around him glowed with accumulated spiritual energy, and he could perceive the network of connections that linked every living and formerly living thing in an intricate web of interdependence. But with this enhanced perception came awareness of how precarious the situation truly was. The spiritual damage that had been done to this place was like a wound that had been festering for generations, growing worse with each passing year. Some of the trapped spirits were beginning to lose their essential humanity, becoming mere echoes of pain and rage that could never be healed if the ritual was delayed much longer. The first sacred object Marcus needed to retrieve was located in the village's original burial ground, a place that had been deliberately obscured and protected by layers of spiritual barriers that made it nearly impossible to find without proper guidance. Following the elders' directions, he traveled deeper into the forest than he had ventured before, moving through terrain that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at it. The burial ground was hidden behind a massive stone formation that appeared to be a natural boulder field, but revealed itself to be carefully arranged when viewed from the correct angle. The entrance was marked by a single flat stone that had been carved with symbols so ancient that they predated any written language Marcus had ever seen. These weren't decorative markings, but rather instructions and warnings left by people who understood the profound spiritual significance of what lay beyond. As Marcus approached the entrance stone, the temperature dropped dramatically, and his breath began to mist in air that felt thick and substantial. The stone itself was warm to the touch, suggesting that it drew energy from sources that had nothing to do with sunlight or external heat. When he placed his palm against its surface, the carved symbols began to glow with gentle light that outlined their forms against the dark rock. The entrance opened not by moving the stone, which would have been impossible given its massive size, but by revealing that what appeared to be solid rock was actually a carefully constructed illusion. When Marcus spoke the words the elder's spirit had taught him, the stone became translucent, allowing him to step through into a space that existed in dimensions beyond normal physical reality. Beyond the entrance lay a vast, underground chamber that couldn't possibly have fit within the hill where it appeared to be located. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above his head, while the floor was covered with carefully tended gardens that grew without any visible source of light. The air smelled of cedar and sage, mixed with something else that spoke of deep earth and ancient secrets. Throughout the chamber, burial mounds rose from the cultivated ground like small hills, each one marked with standing stones that had been carved with the names and achievements of those who rested beneath them. But Marcus could see immediately that something was terribly wrong. Many of the mounds had been disturbed, their careful construction damaged by people who had no understanding of what they were destroying. The spiritual atmosphere in the burial ground was heavy with grief and outrage. Marcus could sense the presence of ancestor spirits who had been traumatized by the violation of their final resting places. These were souls who should have been at peace, watching over their descendants from the tranquil realm that awaited all who had lived honorable lives. Instead, they remained bound to the physical world by the damage that had been done to their remains and the sacred objects that had been buried with them. At the chamber's center stood what Marcus had come to find, a circle of stones that had once formed the medicine wheel used for the village's most important ceremonies. But the wheel had been broken apart, its stones scattered throughout the burial ground in patterns that suggested deliberate desecration rather than random destruction. Each stone was roughly the size of a human head and had been polished smooth by generations of ceremonial use. They were made from different types of rock, each one chosen for its specific spiritual properties and connection to particular directions, seasons, and aspects of the natural world. The stones had been positioned originally to create a harmonious balance of energies that supported both healing rituals and communication with the spirit realm. Marcus began the delicate process of gathering the scattered stones, but each one he touched brought visions of the desecration that had taken place here. He witnessed soldiers and treasure hunters breaking into burial mounds, scattering bones in their search for valuable objects. He saw sacred items being taken as souvenirs, their spiritual significance utterly lost on people who valued them only as curiosities or potential trade goods. Most disturbing were the images of his own ancestor directing this destruction, using his knowledge of sacred traditions to guide the violators to the most important burial sites. Marcus watched in horror as the young man who bore his family's features pointed out the locations of medicine bundles and ceremonial objects, apparently believing that exposing these superstitions to the light of civilization would benefit everyone involved. But the stones also contain memories of better times, visions of ceremonies where the entire community had gathered to mark important transitions and seek guidance from the ancestor spirits. Marcus saw healings that addressed not just physical ailments, but spiritual wounds that could affect entire family lines. He witnessed coming-of-age rituals that connected young people to their cultural heritage and prepared them for the responsibilities of adulthood. As he collected each stone, Marcus felt the weight of generations pressing down on him, understanding that he carried not just physical objects, but the hopes and expectations of people who had died believing that someone would eventually restore what had been broken. On his final day of preparation, Marcus discovered something that shattered everything he thought he understood about his family's connection to this place. While searching for the last pieces of the spiritual guide's walking stick, he ventured into a section of the village he had avoided before, an area that felt somehow more modern, despite maintaining the same architectural style as the rest of the settlement. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in what appeared to be a storage building, Marcus found a metal container that had been deliberately concealed. The box was made from materials that clearly belonged to the 20th century, and when he opened it, his hands began to shake as he recognized objects that belonged to his own family history. The first item was a set of military dog tags bearing his grandfather's name and service number. But these weren't the tags from his grandfather's supposed service in World War II that the family had always talked about. These tags were dated 1952 and bore the insignia of a unit Marcus had never heard his grandfather mention, a special operations group that had apparently been involved in domestic activities rather than overseas combat. Beneath the dog tags lay a collection of photographs that documented his grandfather's repeated visits to the village over a period of decades. The images showed a young man gradually aging into the grandfather Marcus remembered, but they also revealed a secret life that had been completely hidden from the family. In photograph after photograph, his grandfather appeared to be conducting some kind of ongoing project in the village, sometimes alone and sometimes with other men who wore the casual clothes of civilians but carried themselves with military bearing. Most shocking was a leather journal filled with his grandfather's handwriting, documenting years of failed attempts to complete what he called the redemption ritual. The entries revealed that his grandfather had understood far more about the village's spiritual significance than his stories had ever suggested. He had known about the trapped spirits, had experienced the same supernatural encounters that Marcus was living through, and had spent most of his adult life trying to find a way to repair the damage he had helped cause. But the journal also revealed the true extent of that damage. Marcus's grandfather hadn't simply guided soldiers to the village during some historical conflict. He had been part of a modern military operation designed to exploit the village's spiritual properties for purposes that the journal only hinted at in deliberately vague language. The entries from the early 1950s described experiments involving psychic phenomena and extrasensory communication capabilities that suggested his grandfather's unit had been investigating whether the village's spiritual energy could be weaponized. The military had been interested in the possibility of using trapped spirits as a form of supernatural intelligence gathering, or perhaps as a means of psychological warfare against enemies who shared similar spiritual beliefs. Marcus read with growing horror as the journal documented how these experiments had gone terribly wrong. Instead of controlling the spiritual forces present in the village, the military investigators had succeeded only in further traumatizing the trapped spirits and strengthening the barriers that prevented them from finding peace. Each failed experiment had made the situation worse, adding new layers of spiritual damage to wounds that were already festering. His grandfather's later journal entries revealed a man consumed by guilt and desperate to undo what he had participated in. But working alone, without the traditional knowledge necessary for such complex spiritual healing, he had failed repeatedly. Each unsuccessful attempt at redemption had left him more convinced that the task was beyond his capabilities, yet unable to abandon the effort entirely. The final entries in the journal were addressed directly to whoever might eventually follow in his grandfather's footsteps. They contained detailed descriptions of everything he had learned about the village's spiritual landscape, along with frank admissions about the specific ways his unit's activities had worsened the spiritual crisis. Most importantly, they included his grandfather's analysis of why his own redemption attempts had failed and what would be required for someone else to succeed. Marcus closed the journal and sat in the storage building's doorway, trying to process the magnitude of what he had discovered. His grandfather hadn't simply been a young man who had made a mistake during a historical conflict. He had been part of a deliberate, ongoing violation of sacred space that had continued for years and had involved levels of spiritual violence that Marcus was only beginning to understand. But the journal also provided him with crucial information about the final element he needed for the healing ritual. Hidden elsewhere in the village were the remaining pieces of the spiritual guide's walking stick, along with ceremonial regalia that his grandfather had secretly preserved, in hopes that someone might eventually be able to use them properly. The celestial alignment would begin in less than 12 hours, and Marcus finally understood the full scope of what he was being asked to accomplish. Following the directions in his grandfather's journal, Marcus located the final cache of hidden objects in a place that made his blood run cold. Buried beneath the roots of the scarred oak tree where he had found the broken tomahawk was modern surveying equipment from 1952. Tools that had been used to map the village, not for protection, but for exploitation. The metal case containing the surveying instruments had been carefully sealed against moisture and time, preserving its contents in perfect condition. When Marcus opened it, he found transit levels, measuring chains, and detailed topographical maps that showed the village's location with military precision. But these weren't the tools of his grandfather's supposed hydroelectric survey. The equipment bore markings that identified it as property of a classified government research program, and the maps included notations that referenced anomalous energy readings and psychoactive environmental factors. Most disturbing were the detailed reports documenting experiments that had been conducted in the village over a period of several years. Marcus read with growing horror as clinical language, described attempts to measure and manipulate what the researchers called residual spiritual phenomena. The scientists had treated the trapped spirits as subjects for investigation, rather than souls deserving respect and peace. The reports revealed that Marcus's grandfather had served as both guide and translator during these experiments, using his mixed heritage and limited knowledge of traditional practices to help researchers communicate with the spirits. But the interactions had been designed to extract information rather than provide healing, and each contact had increased the spiritual trauma suffered by the trapped souls. Among the surveying equipment, Marcus found something that changed his understanding of the village's current situation entirely. A modern electromagnetic field detector showed readings that were off any normal scale, indicating energy sources that defied conventional physics. The device continued to function despite its age, its displays showing that the village existed in a state of constant electromagnetic flux that grew stronger as the celestial alignment approached. But the most significant discovery was a collection of photographs taken during the 1950s experiments. These images showed the village during the day, but unlike Marcus's experience of finding it apparently abandoned, the photographs revealed crowds of spirit figures gathered around the researchers. The spirits were visible in the black and white photographs as translucent human shapes, their faces showing expressions of anguish and desperation as they tried to communicate with people who viewed them only as test subjects. Marcus realized that his grandfather's unit had been able to see and interact with the spirits far more directly than he had experienced. The researchers had used equipment and techniques that had forced the spirits to manifest in ways that were traumatic and exhausting for beings who were already suffering from decades of spiritual displacement. The final item in the cache was a letter his grandfather had written but never sent, addressed to the surviving members of the research unit. In it, he confessed his growing understanding that their work had been not just misguided, but actively evil. He described supernatural encounters that had shown him the true cost of their investigations, spirit communications that had revealed the depth of suffering they were causing. The letter also contained his grandfather's analysis of why the village's spiritual problems had grown worse rather than better over the years since the experiments ended. Each attempt at scientific investigation had created new barriers between the physical and spiritual worlds, adding artificial obstacles to the natural processes that should have allowed the trapped spirits to find their way to final rest. But most importantly, the letter included detailed instructions for dismantling the spiritual barriers that the research unit had inadvertently created. Marcus's grandfather had spent decades studying traditional healing practices, trying to understand how to undo the damage his unit had caused. He had eventually acquired the knowledge necessary for the healing ritual, but by then his health was failing, and he lacked the physical strength required for such demanding spiritual work. As Marcus read the letter, he understood that his grandfather had hidden these materials not out of shame, but as a deliberate legacy. The old man had known that someone from their bloodline would eventually be drawn to the village, and he had prepared everything that person would need to complete the redemption process successfully. The celestial alignment would reach its peak in less than 6 hours, and Marcus finally possessed all the elements necessary for the healing ritual. The broken tomahawk, the restored medicine wheel stones, the spiritual guide's walking stick that he had found in pieces and carefully reassembled, and now the knowledge of how to dismantle the artificial barriers that had prevented previous healing attempts from succeeding. But as he prepared for the most important night of his life, Marcus also understood that he was about to risk everything on a ritual that had never been successfully completed, using spiritual techniques that could easily destroy him if he made even small mistakes in their execution. As the sun set on Marcus's final day in the village, he began the careful process of preparing for the healing ritual that would either free the trapped spirits or claim his own soul in the attempt. Following the detailed instructions his grandfather had left behind, he spent hours arranging the sacred objects in precise patterns around the stone circle, each placement calculated to create the proper flow of spiritual energy. The medicine wheel stones were positioned first, their arrangement recreating the ceremonial circle that had been broken during the village's destruction. Each stone had to be placed not just in the correct location, but oriented to specific cardinal directions, their polished surfaces reflecting the dying light in patterns that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm. At the circle's center, Marcus placed the restored walking stick, its eagle feather crown pointing toward the sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. The broken tomahawk lay beside the staff, its two pieces arranged to suggest eventual reunification, while still acknowledging the spiritual damage that had been done to this place. Around the perimeter of the medicine wheel, Marcus arranged the corn-husk dolls representing the children's spirits, their small forms creating a protective barrier of innocence and hope. Each doll had moved of its own accord to take its position, the children's spirits understanding that they would play a crucial role in the healing process that was about to begin. The ceremonial regalia his grandfather had preserved lay waiting nearby, traditional clothing that would connect Marcus to the spiritual authority necessary for conducting such a complex ritual. The outfit included items that had belonged to the village's most powerful spiritual leaders, garments that had been worn during healing ceremonies for generations before the final catastrophe. As darkness fell completely, the celestial alignment began to manifest in ways that were visible even to ordinary perception. The stars seemed brighter and closer than usual, arranged in patterns that created geometric shapes across the sky. The moon, nearly full, cast light that had an unusual quality, illuminating the village with silver radiance that made every surface appear to glow from within. Marcus began changing into the ceremonial clothing, feeling the weight of generations settling on his shoulders as each garment was properly arranged. The shirt was made from deerskin so soft it felt like fabric, decorated with beadwork that depicted the spiritual journey of souls moving from physical existence to eternal rest. Leggings and moccasins completed the outfit, each item crafted with skills that had been passed down through countless generations. The transformation was profound and immediate. As soon as the ceremonial regalia was properly worn, Marcus felt his perception expanding to encompass spiritual dimensions that had been invisible before. The village around him became translucent, revealing the spiritual architecture that existed parallel to its physical form. He could see the trapped spirits clearly now, hundreds of souls gathered at the edges of the ceremony ground, their faces showing hope mixed with desperate fear. But he could also see the artificial barriers that his grandfather's research unit had created, walls of disruptive energy that cut through the village's spiritual landscape like scars. These barriers prevented the natural flow of energy between worlds, trapping the spirits in a liminal space where they could neither return to physical existence nor move on to final. Ernest, the spiritual guide's walking stick, began to emit its own light as the celestial alignment strengthened, the eagle feather at its crown glowing with radiance that had nothing to do with reflected moonlight. Marcus lifted the staff and felt centuries of accumulated spiritual power flowing through the wood into his hands and throughout his body. Around the medicine wheel, the obsidian stones began to resonate with tones so deep they were felt rather than heard. The sacred fire that had burned continuously since Marcus's arrival flared higher, its impossible colors growing more vivid as the alignment reached its peak. The very air itself seemed to thicken, becoming substantial enough to support forms of existence that belonged to neither physical nor purely spiritual realms. Marcus could feel the enormous responsibility of what he was about to attempt. If he succeeded, hundreds of souls would finally find their way to the peace they had been denied for generations. If he failed, his own spirit would join theirs in eternal limbo, and the village would remain a place of suffering until some future descendant might prove strong enough to complete what he had started. The moment had arrived. Marcus raised the glowing staff toward the star-filled sky and began to speak the ancient words that would either heal the wounded boundary between worlds or destroy him in the attempt. The ritual that would determine the fate of countless souls was about to begin. The healing ritual began with words in a language Marcus had never learned but somehow understood completely, ancient syllables that seemed to reshape reality as they were spoken. The spiritual guide's walking stick grew heavier in his hands as power flowed through it, and the eagle feather at its crown began to move as if stirred by winds that existed in dimensions beyond the physical world. Around the medicine wheel, the trapped spirits gathered in numbers that astounded Marcus. He could see them clearly now, hundreds of souls representing not just the village's final inhabitants, but generations of people who had lived and died in this sacred place. Their faces showed hope mixed with the accumulated exhaustion of centuries spent waiting for someone who could guide them home. The artificial barriers created by his grandfather's research unit became visible as walls of crackling energy that cut through the villages. spiritual landscape like wounds that had never healed. Marcus raised the glowing staff and began the complex process of dismantling these barriers, speaking words of dissolution that caused the false walls to flicker and weaken. But the process was more difficult than he had anticipated. Each barrier that fell released chaotic energy that had been trapped for decades, spiritual force that lashed out without direction or purpose. Marcus felt these energies passing through his body like electrical storms, testing his ability to maintain focus while supernatural forces tried to overwhelm his consciousness. The children's spirits played a crucial role in stabilizing the ritual. Their corn-husk dolls began to glow with gentle light that created a protective perimeter around the ceremony, their innocent energy providing an anchor of peace and hope that prevented the released chaos from destroying everything Marcus was trying to accomplish. As the barriers continued to fall, the sacred fire in the center of the obsidian circle flared higher than ever before, its flames reaching toward the star-filled sky in columns of impossible color. The fire began to sing, harmonies that resonated with the fundamental frequencies of existence itself, calling to the trapped spirits and offering them a pathway to the peace they had been seeking for so long. One by one, the spirits began to move toward the fire, but their journey was not simple walking from one location to another. Each soul had to release the pain and anger that had bound them to the physical world, letting go of centuries of justified rage and choosing forgiveness over the comfort of familiar suffering. Marcus watched in wonder as the war chief's spirit approached the fire, carrying his broken tomahawk with dignity that had never been diminished by defeat. The chief placed his shattered weapon beside the sacred flames, and as he did so, the two pieces fused back together in a flash of brilliant light. The restored tomahawk dissolved into pure energy that joined the singing fire, adding the warrior's strength to the forces that were opening the pathway between worlds. The village's spiritual leaders came next, each one contributing their accumulated wisdom to the growing power of the healing fire. Centuries of traditional knowledge flowed into the flames, creating a beacon that would guide other lost souls to safety for generations to come. The artificial barriers that had trapped them crumbled completely, as their creator's own victims chose to transform the tools of their oppression into instruments of liberation. But it was the children's spirits that provided the most profound moment of the entire ritual. Moving together with the innocent trust that had sustained them through their long wait, they approached the fire not with fear, but with joy, understanding that they were finally going home to parents who had been waiting for them in the realm beyond physical existence. As the last of the spirits passed into the singing flames, Marcus felt a transformation taking place in the village itself. The oppressive spiritual atmosphere that had marked this place as wounded began to lift, replaced by a sense of peace and natural balance that spoke of healing completed and wrongs finally made right. The sacred fire settled back to normal size, but its light had changed. Where before it had burned with the desperate intensity of trapped energy seeking release, now it glowed with the gentle warmth of a hearth that welcomed travelers without demanding anything in return. The obsidian stones around the fire pit had lost their urgent vibration, becoming simply beautiful rocks that reflected starlight in their polished surfaces. Marcus placed the spiritual guide's walking stick beside the fire and began to remove the ceremonial regalia, feeling his expanded perception gradually returning to normal human awareness. But he retained something of what he had experienced, a deeper understanding of the connections between all living things and his own responsibility to protect the sacred places that still existed in the world. As dawn broke over the peaceful village, Marcus planted a small seedling in a clay pot beside the restored medicine wheel, a symbol of new life growing from the fertile ground of healing completed. When he finally left the village and returned to the everyday world, he carried with him the knowledge that some wounds could be healed, some wrongs could be made right, and some sacred trusts could be honored even across the span of generations.